The cool London air wrapped around Whitehall like an unseen spectre, threading its way between the historic buildings and pressing against the bodies of tourists who clustered near the iconic Royal Guards. The street bustled with movement, families with cameras, couples with intertwined fingers, school groups chattering in excited whispers, each person drawn to the stoic figures who stood, unmoving, as pillars of discipline and duty. Among them, Lennox Ward moved with an energy that was almost too large for the space he occupied. His voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, louder than it needed to be, the American accent unmistakable as it rolled off his tongue with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no. His friends trailed behind him, their laughter mingling with the ambient noise of the city. The gleam in Lennox's eye was one of mischief, the kind that thrived on attention, the kind that sought the validation of an audience. His gaze locked onto one of the royal guards standing at his post, resplendent in the traditional red tunic and towering bearskin hat, a figure frozen in time amidst a sea of transients. James Holloway did not flinch under the scrutiny. His training had been relentless, countless hours spent perfecting the art of detachment, of stillness, of becoming an entity rather than a man. He was not Lennox's plaything. He was not there for amusement. But Lennox was not the sort to let something as trivial as dignity stand in the way of a joke. The first taunt was casual, almost lazy. A playful mimicry of James's rigid posture, an exaggerated march that drew a ripple of laughter from those who witnessed it. Encouraged, Lennox pressed forward, weaving around the invisible boundary that separated the guard from the public. His grin widened as he leaned in, eyes alight with the glee of someone who had yet to feel the weight of consequence. "You lot really don't blink, do you?" Lennox mused, tilting his head, as if inspecting a wax figure rather than a living, breathing man. "What happens if I do this?" He lunged suddenly, feigning a flinch toward James's face, as if to startle him, as if to catch him off guard. James did not react, but the crowd did. Gasps fluttered through the onlookers, some chuckling nervously, others shifting uncomfortably. A mother with her young daughter edged away, whispering something beneath her breath. An older gentleman, his hands clasped behind his back, frowned in disapproval. There was something inherently distasteful about watching one man attempt to dismantle the dignity of another. The onlookers might not have known James personally, but they recognized what he represented. And what Lennox was doing, this game, this performance, felt wrong. Lennox, however, was blind to the shift in the air. He was feeding off the flickers of amusement, off the iPhones that rose to capture the moment, off the undeniable thrill of spectacle. He pulled a ridiculous face, standing stiffly beside James, mimicking his stance but contorting his expression into a grotesque parody. Another round of laughter erupted, another flicker of a camera lens. Another layer of detachment pressed into James's chest, like bricks stacking upon his ribcage, solidifying the space between who he was and who he had to be. And then Lennox took it further. He reached out, not touching, but close enough that the heat of his fingertips brushed against the polished buttons of James's uniform. A heartbeat passed, silent and thick. The line had been crossed. James felt it before he saw it. The way the atmosphere curdled, the way the respect that had once tethered the crowd to this sacred tradition was unraveling thread by thread. The instinct to move, to defend his space, pulsed within him, coiling tight like a spring wound too far. But he remained rooted. His pulse hammered against the inside of his skull, a steady drumbeat of restraint. Do not react. Do not move. Do not let them win. Lennox, unaware of the invisible battle taking place within the man before him, smirked and turned to his audience as if awaiting applause. And in that moment, something changed. The shift was subtle at first, a murmur that slithered through the crowd, a tightening of expressions that had once been lighthearted. What had begun as amusement was souring into something else entirely. There was an unspoken understanding that had settled over them all, an unvoiced disapproval that thickened the air. It was the sort of collective awareness that turned tides, the moment when laughter stopped and shame set in. One woman lowered her phone. A teenager muttered something to his friend. The older gentleman, the one who had stood quietly in judgment, now shook his head, his gaze heavy with something bordering on disappointment. Lennox, oblivious to the shifting tide, pressed forward. "What's the matter, mate? Cat got your tongue." He let out an exaggerated laugh, slapping his knee in mock delight. But the sound rang hollow, reverberating through the silence that had begun to settle. The onlookers were no longer watching James. They were watching him. And suddenly, the attention that had once felt exhilarating now felt suffocating. The weight of dozens of eyes pressing into him, assessing, questioning, silently condemning. He could feel it creeping in, the realization that he had gone too far, that the spectacle was no longer in his favor. The crowd had turned, and there was nothing quite as damning as the moment when an audience that once cheered begins to judge. James did not move. He did not speak. But he did not need to, because the silence was speaking for him. Lennox shifted uncomfortably, his laughter faltering for the first time. The smugness in his expression wavered, just slightly, just enough for uncertainty to slip through the cracks. The moment stretched long, tense, electric. And then, from somewhere in the crowd, a voice cut through the air, sharp and deliberate. "Leave him be." It was not loud. It was not aggressive. But it was enough. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, threading through the collective consciousness of the crowd. Lennox hesitated. He looked around, searching for support, for validation, for anything that would reassure him that this was still his show. But the moment had shifted, and he was no longer the main act. James remained unmoving, unwavering. But beneath the surface, where no one could see, he felt something stir. Not victory, not triumph, just the quiet, steady weight of knowing that respect, true respect, did not need to be demanded. It was earned, and in that moment, it had been given. The tension remained thick in the air as Lennox took a step back, the first sign of retreat. The cameras had stopped recording. The laughter had died. The moment had changed. But it was not over. Not yet. The weight of the bearskin hat pressed against James Holloway's head, the thick fur trapping the residual warmth of his body as the cool air of Whitehall encircled him. It was an old sensation, familiar, almost comforting in its consistency. The rigid structure of his red tunic fit his form with the same suffocating embrace it always had, the golden buttons polished to a glimmer, each thread of the fabric woven with duty, with legacy, with the kind of discipline that was instilled over generations rather than moments. He had worn this uniform countless times before, had stood in this very spot through scorching summers and bone-chilling winters, enduring the unrelenting scrutiny of the public's eyes. But today, something was different. Today, his uniform felt heavier. The laughter still echoed in his ears, though the crowd had long since dispersed. That American tourist's taunts replayed in his mind like a scene from a poorly acted play, the exaggerated movements, the forced humor, the smug smirk curling at the edges of a privileged mouth. James had been trained to endure moments like that, to withstand mockery, to remain an unshakable presence, to be more statue than man. And yet, as he stood motionless, staring ahead at the gray stone of Whitehall, a peculiar sensation simmered in the pit of his stomach, something foreign, something deeply unsettling. Not anger, no, he had long since learned to suppress that, but something adjacent to it. The crowd had laughed, but they had also shifted, turned, and in that moment, James had felt the weight of their silent disapproval settle upon him, like cloak. Not for him, but for the man who had mocked him. It was a fleeting thing, subtle, like a change in the wind that carried the scent of a coming storm. It had been enough. And yet, the unease remained. His training dictated that he should not dwell on such things, that he should wipe them from his mind as one wipes dust from a polished blade. And so, he inhaled deeply through his nose, steadying himself, reminding himself that he was not merely a man standing on a street corner. He was something more, something greater. Still, the voices in his mind did not quiet. He had stood as his father had before him, and his grandfather before that. The weight of that lineage pressed into him now, heavier than the uniform itself. His father had spoken of honor and service, of the quiet dignity of unwavering discipline. A man who does not flinch, his father had once told him, is a man who commands the respect of the world. And yet, the world had laughed today. He clenched his jaw, staring forward, his gaze fixed on nothing and everything all at once. A royal guard did not speak. A royal guard did not react. A royal guard stood. And so he stood. Even as his stomach twisted, even as his lungs ached for a breath he could not afford to take. The American's face flickered in his mind again, obnoxious, carefree, unburdened by the history that had shaped this land, this tradition, this duty. There was something uniquely galling about the way he had strutted, the way he had basked in the validation of a crowd too eager to laugh at another man's expense. James wondered if he would think of this moment later, if he would replay it as James did now. Probably not. To men like that, mockery was fleeting, an amusement, a forgettable indulgence in the grand scheme of their privileged lives. But to James, it was a moment that would live in his bones, a moment that had carved itself into his mind with the precision of a sculptor's chisel. Not because it had hurt, but because it had mattered. Because it had been seen. He had not moved. He had not reacted. He had done what was expected of him. And yet, there was no pride in it tonight, only the dull ache of something unresolved. He was dismissed from duty at sunset, the ritual of transition as seamless as ever. He walked with measured steps toward the barracks, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable. Inside, the halls were quiet, save for the distant murmur of conversation among his fellow guards. James did not join them. Instead, he went to his quarters, the familiar walls offering no comfort, the neatly made bed untouched since morning. He removed his hat first, setting it down with the care of a man handling something sacred. Then the tunic, the buttons unfastened one by one with mechanical precision. When at last he stood in the plain undershirt beneath, he exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. His reflection in the small mirror above his dresser stared back at him, sharp jawline, neatly trimmed hair, eyes that had seen too much and yet not enough. The silence pressed in around him. He sat on the edge of his bed, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers laced together. The tension in his shoulders refused to ease, the stiffness of his posture betraying the storm within. He had endured countless days like this before. But tonight, he felt the weight of it differently. He wondered what his father would say. Would he be proud that James had held his ground? Or would he see the cracks beneath the surface, the quiet unrest festering beneath the polished exterior? James's hands curled into fists. Respect. It was a word that men threw around so carelessly, as if it were something to be demanded rather than earned. The American had not understood what he had mocked. And perhaps that was the most infuriating part. The ignorance. The casual disregard. James closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. He had been raised to believe that dignity was something internal, something unshakable. That no mockery, no insult, no passing humiliation could strip a man of his worth. But tonight, he was not sure if he believed that as strongly as he once had. Outside, the city continued its restless pulse, indifferent to the turmoil within him. Tomorrow, he would stand again. Tomorrow, he would endure again. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, James Holloway felt the slow, creeping tide of doubt stirring within him. And he did not know what to do with it. The storm had begun to brew long before Lennox Ward even realized the sky was darkening. It was the nature of things, the slow, creeping tide of consequence moving in silence, swelling beneath the surface while the foolish still danced in the light, unaware that the shadows were stretching toward them. He had left Whitehall that afternoon in high spirits, chest swollen with the kind of misplaced pride that came from feeling untouchable. The world had been laughing with him, or so he had thought. The cameras had captured every moment, every exaggerated movement, every second of his mockery immortalized in pixels and broadcasted to an audience that always demanded more. More spectacle, more audacity, more disregard, and Lennox had given it to them. Even now, hours later, his phone was alive with the aftershocks of his performance. Notifications streamed in relentlessly, likes, shares, comments stacking upon one another, building a monument to his fleeting moment of amusement. He leaned back in the stiff chair of his hotel room, scrolling through the avalanche of reactions with a smug grin pulling at his lips. They loved him. They always did. Asterisk, mate, this is gold. Asterisk, asterisk, I swear these guys are like robots. No emotions, no soul. Asterisk, asterisk, dying of laughter, best video of the day. Asterisk. The comments were a chorus of validation, each one stroking the ego that had long since outgrown the space it occupied. He relished it, basked in it, feeding on the attention like a man starved. But amid the sea of approval, something else had begun to seep through. Something colder, sharper. Asterisk, disgusting display of disrespect. Asterisk, asterisk, you wouldn't last a second in their boots. Asterisk, asterisk, I hope this comes back to bite you. Asterisk. Lennox frowned, scrolling faster. There were more now. A lot more. The voices of disapproval were no longer whispers lost in the crowd. They were growing, surging, multiplying like a fire that had found dry wood to feast upon. His smirk faltered, fingers tightening around the phone. The words were changing, shifting from playful mockery to something far more dangerous. Asterisk, shameful. Asterisk. Asterisk, this is why people hate tourists like you. Asterisk, asterisk, you think this is funny? Try actually serving your country. Asterisk, asterisk, your arrogance is nauseating. Asterisk, a cold trickle ran down the back of his neck. He sat up, scrolling faster, his heart thudding with an unspoken urgency. He had expected some backlash. There were always a few humorless people in every crowd, but this was different. This was growing, evolving, becoming something far beyond his control. His name was beginning to appear in threads outside of his own. His face, once a badge of pride, was now being plastered across posts dripping with disdain. And then he saw it. A repost. Not from some random user, not from an account buried in the depths of the internet, but from an actual news outlet. The headline slammed into his chest with the force of a hammer. American tourist publicly mocks British Royal Guard. Backlash ensues. Lennox felt the blood drain from his face. His fingers trembled slightly as he tapped the link, his breath hitching in his throat. The article unfolded before him, his own actions dissected under the cold, clinical scrutiny of the press. The tone was not forgiving. It was not amused. It was damning. Asterisk, a shocking display of disrespect toward one of Britain's most historic institutions occurred today as American tourist Lennox Ward openly ridiculed a member of the Queen's Guard in Whitehall. The incident, which was captured on video and quickly went viral, has sparked outrage across social media, with many condemning Ward's behavior as arrogant and ignorant. Asterisk, the words blurred in front of his eyes. His own name burned against the screen, each syllable sharp, inescapable. His chest tightened. It wasn't supposed to be like this. They weren't supposed to turn on him. But they had. And it was only getting worse. His phone vibrated violently in his palm, another notification, another storm brewing. This time, it was a message from his father. Asterisk, call me. Now. Asterisk. A lump formed in Lennox's throat. He swallowed hard, forcing down the rising panic that threatened to claw its way out of his chest. His father was not a man of many words. And when he spoke, it was with purpose. His thumb hovered over the call button. He hesitated. The phone rang before he could decide, his father's name flashing across the screen like a warning sign. He inhaled sharply and answered, "Dad, what the hell have you done?" The words were a razor's edge, cutting straight to the bone. Lennox opened his mouth, but no sound came. "I have customers calling the shop, Lennox," his father continued, voice steady, but laced with something dangerous. "Customers who have known me for years. People I've built relationships with. And now they're calling, telling me they won't step foot in our store again because of you." A weight settled in his stomach, heavy and sinking. He clenched his jaw. "It's just a joke." "No, it's not," his father snapped. "Not to them. Not to the thousands of people calling you an embarrassment. And not to me." Lennox's pulse roared in his ears. "It's the internet, Dad. This stuff blows over." His father let out a humorless laugh. "Does it? Have you looked at your emails? Your social media? Because it sure as hell isn't blowing over. It's growing." Lennox felt a sickening drop in his gut. "You think this is funny?" His father's voice was quieter now, but no less lethal. "You think disrespecting another man, someone doing their job, makes you look clever? Makes you look important?" A pause. "You look like a fool." The words struck deeper than Lennox expected. He gritted his teeth. "I didn't mean for it to." "That doesn't matter," his father cut in. "It never matters what you meant, Lennox. Only what you did." Silence hung between them. Thick. Unforgiving. "I'm ashamed of you," his father finally said. "And I never thought I'd have to say that." The call ended. Lennox sat in the suffocating quiet of his hotel room, the world closing in around him. The screen of his phone still glowed, a relentless flood of condemnation pouring in, swallowing him whole. He had always thought himself untouchable. He was wrong. And this was only the beginning. The walls of the hotel room seemed to close in around Lennox Ward, suffocating him in a silence that felt thicker than the air itself. Just hours ago, he had been at the center of attention, standing proudly in the midst of Whitehall, drinking in the laughter, the applause, the flashes of cameras immortalizing his little performance. But now, alone, the weight of consequence was beginning to settle on his chest like an iron shackle. The glow of his phone screen flickered in the dimly lit room, illuminating his face in cold, sterile light. The notifications had not stopped, not even for a second. They poured in relentlessly, one after another, a cascading avalanche of fury and ridicule. His fingers gripped the device tightly as he scrolled, his jaw tightening with every scathing comment. Asterisk, disgusting. Absolute disgrace. Asterisk, asterisk, hope you never set foot in the UK again. Asterisk, asterisk, mocking a man for doing his job? Pathetic. Asterisk, asterisk, you think you're funny? Let's see you stand in the freezing cold, unwavering, while entitled idiots like you make a spectacle of themselves. Asterisk. The words slashed at him, cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. There was a sour, sinking feeling in his stomach, a feeling he had not quite experienced before, something between nausea and panic. He had always been the type to laugh things off, to shrug and move on, but this wasn't something he could just ignore. His fingers trembled slightly as he swiped to refresh the page. The anger was spreading, no longer contained to just the video comments. News outlets, influencers, military veterans, everyone seemed to have an opinion, and none of them favored him. A sharp knock at the door made him jolt, his pulse slamming against his ribcage. He hesitated. For a brief, irrational moment, he wondered if it was someone coming to confront him in person. The thought sent a shiver up his spine. But then another knock, louder this time. Slowly, he pushed himself up from a chair and crossed the room, his limbs heavy, as if he were wading through water. He unlocked the door and cracked it open just enough to see who stood on the other side. His friend Callum leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "You gonna let me in?" Callum's voice was unusually flat. Lennox hesitated for a beat before stepping aside, allowing him to enter. The door clicked shut behind them, enclosing them in the suffocating quiet once more. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Callum shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, his gaze sweeping over the hotel room. It was a mess, half-unpacked luggage strewn across the floor, a room service tray with untouched food, the TV on but muted. It reeked of someone spiraling, someone whose world was beginning to collapse in real time. "You've really done it this time," Callum muttered, finally breaking the silence. Lennox bristled. "Oh, come on. It's not that bad." Callum let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Not that bad. Mate, your face is plastered on news articles calling you the most insufferable tourist of the year. People are digging into your past, your family. Your dad's business is getting bombarded with bad reviews from people who've never even stepped foot in his shop." He exhaled sharply. "And you think this isn't that bad?" Lennox opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he turned away, rubbing a hand over his face. "I didn't mean for it to blow up like this." "Well, it did," Callum shot back. "And you've got no one to blame but yourself." The weight of the words pressed down on Lennox's chest. His mind flashed back to the moment outside Whitehall, the guard standing still as a statue, unmoving, unreadable. James Holloway. That was his name. Lennox hadn't even given him a second thought at the time, had barely considered the reality of the man behind the uniform. But now, he couldn't shake the image from his mind. The silence, the dignity, the way the crowd had turned, not against the guard but against him. Karma had a way of working fast. Lennox sank onto the edge of the bed, staring down at the carpeted floor. His heart was pounding, but for the first time, he wasn't sure if it was from anger or fear. "I didn't think it would matter," he admitted quietly, almost to himself. Callum scoffed. "Of course you didn't, because it wasn't happening to you." He ran a hand through his hair, exasperated. "Do you know what those guards go through? The training, the discipline. You think they stand there because they have nothing better to do? That guy, James or whatever his name is, he wasn't just some bloke in a funny hat. He was a soldier doing his job, representing something bigger than himself. And you turned him into a joke." Lennox's stomach twisted uncomfortably. "They're saying he might get disciplinary action," Callum continued, his voice heavy. "Because of you." Lennox's head snapped up. "Wait, what? That's not my fault." "Oh, isn't it?" Callum's gaze was sharp. The video went viral, the palace had to respond, and now there's talk about whether he handled it properly or not. All because some idiot thought it'd be funny to get in his face. A cold chill ran through Lennox's veins. He had never considered the possibility that James could face consequences for what had happened. In his mind, the guard had been untouchable, an immovable object, just another part of the spectacle. But now the idea that he might be punished for standing there, for doing nothing, twisted something deep inside him. A new kind of guilt settled into his bones, one that couldn't be shrugged off with bravado. Callum sighed, running a hand down his face. "Look, man, I didn't come here to lecture you, but you need to fix this. Or at least try." Lennox swallowed hard. How? His voice was quieter now, uncertain. Callum exhaled. I don't know. But the way I see it, you've got two choices. You can double down, act like none of this matters, and watch your life fall apart piece by piece. Or, he hesitated, or you can own up to it, publicly. Lennox stared at him. The thought of standing in front of a camera, of admitting fault, made his skin crawl. He had spent his whole life avoiding consequences, slipping away from trouble before it could stick. But this time, there was nowhere to run. His throat felt dry. What if it's too late? Callum studied him for a long moment. Then you'll find out what it really means to face the consequences of your actions. Lennox let the words settle, heavy and inescapable. For the first time in his life, he realized he might not be the one in control of the story anymore. And that terrified him. The moment Lennox Ward answered the call, he knew something was wrong. There was a heaviness in the air, a charged silence that stretched thin between the crackling static of the transatlantic line. His mother's voice, usually warm, steady, the kind of voice that had soothed him as a child when thunderstorms rattled against the window panes, was stripped of all familiarity. It was tight, hollow. Lennox. Just his name. A single syllable, clipped and weighted. He swallowed. Mum. A pause. Not hesitation, something worse. Resignation. Your father's gone out, she said finally, and though she tried to keep her voice even, there was a sharp edge beneath it, something brittle that cracked at the seams. Lennox's grip tightened around his phone. Out where? A sigh. A weary, exhausted exhale that made his stomach turn. To the shop. Another pause. To deal with the damage. The words slammed into him, harder than he expected. His father's shop, the small, family-run hardware store that had stood on the same corner for nearly 3 decades, wasn't just a business. It was his father's pride, his legacy. And now, thanks to him, it was under siege. I didn't think it was that bad, Lennox muttered, running a hand through his hair. His mother let out a short, humorless laugh, but there was no amusement in it. Didn't think it was that bad, she repeated, and the words felt heavier coming from her lips. Do you even know what's happening? Lennox hesitated. He thought he did. The backlash had been brutal, yes, but it was the internet. It was always a storm, always moving, always finding a new target. He figured it would pass, that the next scandal, the next idiot who made a fool of themselves would come along and push him out of the public's memory. But what if it didn't? He started, but his mother didn't let him finish. Your father's been getting calls, she said, her voice growing sharper now. Not just from customers, but from reporters. Strangers. People threatening to boycott his store, Lennox. People leaving fake reviews, driving away real customers. We've had people calling the house, for God's sake. Lennox felt his pulse quicken. Wait, people are calling you. His mother exhaled, the weight of it pressing through the phone. Yes. And it's not just angry voices, Lennox. Her voice lowered. It's threats. A cold chill ran down his spine. People are saying things. That they'll show up at the shop. That they'll make sure we pay for what you've done. His stomach twisted violently. This wasn't just about him anymore. His father, an honest, hard-working man who had spent years building something from the ground up, was now the collateral damage in a war Lennox had started without realizing it. His mother, a woman who had spent her life keeping their family together, now lived in fear of what might happen next. And all because of him. His mother's voice softened, but somehow that was worse. Lennox, she hesitated, as if weighing her words. Your father won't say it, but this is breaking him. The breath he'd been holding escaped in a shuddering exhale. I'll fix this, he whispered, but even as the words left his lips, he wasn't sure if they were a promise or a plea. His mother was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, I hope so. And then the line went dead. Lennox stood there, frozen, the quiet hum of the disconnected call filling the space around him. For the first time in his life, he felt small. His father's shop wasn't big, just a modest storefront on a quiet street, tucked between a cafe and an old bookstore that smelled of leather and dust. It had been there for as long as Lennox could remember, the same wooden sign hanging above the door, the paint slightly chipped from years of weathering. But when he arrived, it wasn't the same. Graffiti stained the walls, angry, jagged words scrawled in red and black paint. Disgrace, coward, go back to America. Someone had smashed one of the windows, jagged glass still glinting along the edges of the frame. The sign above the door had been defaced, the name Ward's Hardware barely visible beneath a mess of slurs and curses. Lennox felt his stomach drop. His father was inside. Through the shattered glass, he could see him, an older man, strong but weary, sweeping the broken shards into a dustpan. He moved slowly, methodically, as if he were simply cleaning up another mess at the end of a workday. But Lennox could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands trembled ever so slightly as he worked. A lump formed in his throat. His father hadn't noticed him yet. He was too focused, too lost in his own world of quiet damage control. Lennox hesitated. Then finally he stepped inside. The small bell above the door jingled, a sound he had heard 1,000 times growing up, but today it felt out of place. His father looked up. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then his father straightened, setting the dustpan aside. His expression was unreadable. "You shouldn't be here." Lennox swallowed. "Dad, Go home, Lennox." His father's voice was firm but tired. "I just wanted to." His father cut him off with a sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. "You think showing up here fixes anything?" He gestured toward the damage around them. "Look at this. Look at what you've done." Lennox's chest tightened. "I didn't do this." His father's eyes, once full of warmth, hardened. "No, but you caused it." The words landed like a punch. Lennox lowered his gaze, shame clawing at his insides. He had spent so long running from the consequences, treating this entire thing like a storm that would pass, like something that could be laughed off. But this wasn't just about him. It had never been just about him. His father sighed, softer this time. "You were always reckless, Lennox. Always pushing too far, thinking nothing could touch you." His voice lowered. "But it's different now, isn't it?" Lennox said nothing. His father watched him for a moment longer, then turned back to his work, picking up the dustpan once more. "I have a business to fix," he muttered. "You should go." Lennox clenched his fists, the weight of everything pressing down on him. For the first time, he didn't know how to fix this. And for the first time, he realized that maybe he couldn't. But he had to try, even if it was too late. The weight of James Holloway's uniform felt different that morning. It wasn't heavier in a physical sense. No, the red tunic still sat rigid on his frame, the polished buttons glinting in the morning light, as they always did. The bearskin hat pressed against his brow with its familiar density, its presence a constant reminder of the centuries-old duty he had sworn to uphold. But there was something else now. A weight beyond fabric and tradition. Something unseen, yet suffocating. The events of the previous days clung to him like damp wool. The American tourist. The laughter. The video. The ripple effect that followed, extending far beyond that brief, humiliating moment outside Whitehall. The higher-ups had called him in yesterday, their expressions carved from stone, their voices calm but pointed. There had been no outright blame placed upon him, no formal accusation, yet James had felt the scrutiny settle over him like a slow-moving shadow. "You did nothing wrong," one of them had said, his voice lacking any real reassurance. "But given the media coverage, we must consider the optics of the situation." That was the word they kept using. Optics. Not duty. Not honor. Not sacrifice. Just optics. As if his role, his discipline, his very existence in that moment had been reduced to a question of public perception. He had swallowed his frustration, standing at attention as they spoke, nodding in all the right places, offering the precise, measured responses expected of him. Inside, however, something had begun to shift. A slow, simmering disquiet that he had no words for. And now, as he stood at his post once more, unmoving, unyielding, the city of London bustling around him, James felt it again, that gnawing sensation, a whisper of something just beyond his reach. He had always been good at tuning out the world. It was part of the job, a skill honed through years of training. The tourists came and went, their presence nothing more than background noise, their curiosity expected, tolerated, ignored. But today, the weight of their stares burned against his skin. A group gathered nearby, hushed voices murmuring behind raised smartphones. Some took photos, others simply watched, their expressions unreadable. Were they waiting for another spectacle? Another scene to capture, to dissect, to spread like wildfire across the internet? James kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his posture unwavering. But inside, the question swirled. Did they see him as a man, or merely as a symbol to be toyed with? Somewhere in the distance, a bus rumbled past. A pigeon fluttered onto the pavement, pecking absently at a discarded crisp wrapper. Life moved forward as it always did. But James felt as though he were stuck in place, trapped in a moment that refused to release him. And then, from the corner of his vision, he saw him. Lennox Ward. The recognition was instant. Though James had not known the man's name at the time of their encounter, it had been impossible to avoid in the days that followed. His face had been splashed across news articles, his name muttered in disapproving tones among colleagues, his arrogance dissected by thousands online. And now, here he was standing just feet away, looking nothing like the man from the video. James did not move, did not react, but he watched. Lennox hesitated at the edge of the crowd, his usual bravado conspicuously absent. He was alone this time. No friends, no cameras in sight. The cocky smirk that had once been plastered across his face was gone, replaced by something quieter, something unsettled. For a long moment, he simply stood there, shifting his weight from foot to foot, hands shoved into his pockets. He glanced around as if debating whether to approach, then looked directly at James. The tension stretched between them, invisible but taut, a rope pulled tight between two opposing forces. And then, slowly, almost hesitantly, Lennox took a step forward. James felt the crowd stir, eyes flickering between them, a silent anticipation settling over the space. Lennox stopped just within earshot. The sounds of the city continued around them, the distant honk of a car, the rhythmic clip of footsteps against pavement. And yet, in that moment, it felt as though the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Lennox exhaled, running a hand through his hair. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than James expected. "Look, mate." He hesitated, shaking his head slightly, as if the words were struggling to form. A pause. A frown. "I screwed up." James remained silent. Lennox shifted again, rubbing the back of his neck. His gaze flickered downward, then back up, uncertainty flickering in his expression. "I didn't think," he admitted. "Didn't think about you. About what this job means. He sighed. About anything other than getting a laugh." The words hung between them, fragile, uncertain. James studied him, searching for insincerity. But there was no smugness now, no arrogance, just a man who had finally begun to understand the weight of his own actions. A long silence stretched between them. James considered his options. He could ignore him. He could let the moment pass, let Lennox sit in the discomfort of his own making, let him leave without the absolution he was clearly seeking. Or, James shifted slightly, just enough to break the rigidity of his stance. He met Lennox's gaze, his voice even measured. "You don't get to take it back." Lennox flinched just barely, but he nodded. "I know." James let the words settle. Then, after a beat, he spoke again. "But you can make it mean something." Lennox's brow furrowed slightly. James didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. For the first time, he saw a flicker of realization in the other man's expression. A moment of understanding, not just of the consequences, but of the responsibility that came with them. Lennox swallowed, nodding again, this time with more certainty. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away. James watched him go, the tension in his chest easing ever so slightly. The damage had been done. But perhaps, just perhaps, something could still be salvaged from it. The world had never felt so small. Lennox Ward sat in the dim glow of his hotel room, the only light coming from a phone clutched tightly in his hands. The screen flickered relentlessly, a relentless flood of notifications, emails, messages, some angry, some scathing, others cutting in a way that words rarely did. He had thought, foolishly, that things had reached their peak, that the backlash had hit its highest point, that there was nothing more left to unravel. He was wrong. The headlines were worse now. They weren't just calling him out, they were dismantling him piece by piece, reducing his name to a symbol of arrogance, of ignorance, of everything people despised about those who took too much and gave nothing in return. Asterisk, Ward faces professional fallout after disrespecting British tradition. Asterisk, asterisk calls for legal action against American tourist who mocked Royal Guard. Asterisk, asterisk from viral sensation to global shame, the rise and fall of Lennox Ward. Asterisk. His stomach twisted. He could almost feel the walls closing in around him. It wasn't just strangers on the internet anymore. The fallout had seeped into every crevice of his life, reaching places he never thought it would. His inbox was filled with emails from brands he had worked with, sponsors he had partnered with, each one echoing the same sentiment in carefully crafted corporate language. "We regret to inform you that we are terminating our contract." At this time, we believe it is best to distance ourselves from this situation. We can no longer associate with your public image. Lennox exhaled shakily, his fingers gripping the phone tighter. He scrolled further. The worst of it came next. An email from his employer. His actual, real-world job, the one he had kept separate from his online antics, the one he thought was safe from all of this. Asterisk effective immediately. We are placing you on indefinite suspension pending further review of your conduct. We will be in touch regarding next steps. Asterisk. His breath caught in his throat. Suspension. Not a warning. Not a slap on the wrist. Indefinite. Lennox's hands began to tremble. It had been easy for a time to pretend that all of this was just an overreaction. That the internet had simply done what it always did, latched onto something, blown it out of proportion, and moved on. He had convinced himself that if he simply waited it out, people would forget. They always did, didn't they? But the world was not forgetting. The world was watching. And now, it was taking things from him. The hotel room felt colder now, emptier. The city outside carried on as usual, cars passing below, voices drifting through the open window, the murmur of life moving forward. And yet Lennox felt as though he were sinking, his world shrinking down to the tiny space between him and the glow of his phone. Then his phone buzzed again. A new email. His father. His breath hitched. Asterisk, I don't know who you are anymore. Asterisk. The words sliced through him, sharper than any comment from a stranger ever could. For a long time, he just stared at the screen, his mind blank, his pulse roaring in his ears. He had done this. This wasn't bad luck. This wasn't misfortune. This was him. His actions. His choices. And for the first time, sitting there in the quiet suffocation of his own making, he realized he might not be able to fix this. The world had turned against him. And it wasn't finished yet. The streets of London had never felt this unwelcoming before. Lennox Ward walked with his head low, hands buried deep in his pockets, the chill of the morning air biting through the fabric of his jacket. He had spent years believing himself untouchable, coasting through life with the confidence of a man who had never truly faced the weight of consequence. But now he felt every stare, every whisper, every unspoken judgment. The city seemed to reject him, the air thick with a tension that was no longer imagined but real. The world was watching. He had seen it unfold in real time. The shift. The moment when amusement had curdled into something else, something far more dangerous. It had been slow at first, like a tide creeping in, gentle, almost imperceptible. But then the waters had risen. The laughter had stopped. And what remained was the cold, unrelenting force of scrutiny. People recognized him now. Not as a traveler, not as just another face in the crowd, but as him, the man from the video. The man who mocked. The man who disrespected. The man who was now paying for it. Lennox had been naive to think the storm would pass quickly. That it would blow over, lost in the endless cycle of internet outrage. But the storm hadn't passed. It had only grown stronger, reaching places he never expected. It wasn't just online anymore. It had seeped into the real world, into his job, into his home, into the very fabric of his existence. And no matter how fast he walked, no matter how hard he tried to disappear into the crowd, he couldn't outrun it. He felt it now, the way eyes lingered on him just a second too long. The way a stranger's gaze would flicker with recognition before quickly looking away, as if acknowledging him might somehow stain them as well. As he passed a cafe, a group of young professionals sat at the window, their faces illuminated by the glow of their phones. One of them looked up. Their eyes met through the glass. It lasted only a moment, but it was enough. The stranger's lips curled, amusement mixed with something sharper. Disdain. A slight shake of the head. A whisper to their companions. Lennox forced himself to keep walking. He should have been used to it by now. The murmurs. The smirks. The looks. But he wasn't. And maybe he never would be. He pulled his phone from his pocket, hesitating before unlocking it. He already knew what awaited him, more messages, more backlash, more reminders of how far he had fallen. But a part of him couldn't stop himself from looking, from scrolling through the wreckage. The latest headline hit like a fist to the gut. Asterisk Lennox Ward, a case study in entitlement and humiliation. Asterisk. He nearly laughed. A case study. As if he weren't a person anymore, but a lesson to be taught. A cautionary tale. His fingers hovered over the article, tempted to read it, to see just how deeply they had dissected him. But he knew better. He knew it would only dig the knife in further. Instead, he swiped to his messages. His inbox was still a war zone. Hundreds of unread messages, a mix of angry strangers, distant acquaintances, and the few people in his life who had bothered to reach out. And then, at the top of the list, his father. Lennox hesitated before tapping on the message. Asterisk, the shop is closed. We couldn't keep up with the damage. Asterisk. He stopped walking. The world around him blurred. The shop. Closed. Lennox's breath came short and shallow, his pulse hammering in his ears. His father's store had survived economic downturns, competition, even the slow death of small businesses in a world that no longer seemed to have space for them. But it had not survived him. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating, relentless. He had done this. He had destroyed something his father had spent a lifetime building. A fresh wave of nausea rolled through him, and for the first time since this entire disaster began, he wanted to run. Not just from the city, not just from headlines, but from himself, from the person he had been, from the person he had become. He turned into a narrow alleyway, leaning against the damp brick wall, his hands shaking as he exhaled. He had always thought of himself as someone who could talk his way out of anything, someone who could spin a story, turn a mistake into a joke, charm his way back into people's good graces. But there was no talking his way out of this. There was no charm, no joke, no excuse that could undo the damage. His father's shop was gone. His job was gone. His reputation shattered beyond repair. For the first time in his life, Lennox understood what it meant to truly lose. And the worst part, he deserved it. A soft drizzle began to fall, the cold droplets landing against his skin, soaking into his clothes. He didn't move, didn't care. Somewhere in the distance, laughter rang out. Carefree, effortless. A sound he no longer recognized. Because no matter where he went, no matter how far he tried to escape, the truth remained. Lennox Ward was no longer the man he thought he was. And he had no idea who he was supposed to be now. The letter arrived in a plain white envelope. No markings, no return address, just his name written in a sharp, deliberate hand. James Holloway recognized the writing instantly. He hesitated before picking it up, his fingers hovering just above the smooth paper. The barracks were quiet at this hour, most of the men either out on duty or tucked away in their quarters, seeking refuge from the unrelenting London drizzle. But James remained where he was, standing alone in the dim corridor, staring down at the envelope as if it held the weight of something far heavier than just words. It had been days since he had last seen Lennox Ward. Since that brief, uncomfortable moment outside Whitehall when the once arrogant tourist had stood before him, stripped of his bravado, his voice carrying something James hadn't expected, regret. But regret alone was not enough. Regret was a hollow thing if it did not come with action. James had learned that the hard way. He exhaled through his nose, finally taking the envelope in his hands, his movements precise as he unfolded the letter inside. And then he began to read. James. Asterisk, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to reply. But I need you to know that I understand now. Or at least I'm trying to. Asterisk. James's brow furrowed slightly. The paper was slightly creased, as if it had been folded and unfolded too many times, the ink slightly smudged in places. He imagined Lennox writing this, hesitating, second-guessing himself, struggling with words that had once come so easily. Asterisk, you don't owe me anything. Not your time, not your attention, nothing. If I were you, I'd probably tear this up without reading it. God knows I deserve that. But if you do read it, if you get this far, then I hope you'll let me say what I should have said that day. Asterisk. James's jaw tightened, his grip on the paper firming. Asterisk, I was wrong. And not just in the way that people say when they get caught doing something stupid. I was wrong in a way that I don't know if I can fix. I mocked something I didn't understand. I treated your uniform like a costume, your discipline like an act, your silence like an invitation for entertainment. And I did it because I never once considered what it meant. What you meant. Asterisk. James swallowed. Asterisk. I spent my life thinking that the world was mine to joke about. That nothing really mattered unless I decided it did. And then, for the first time, I became the joke. And I hated it. But hating it didn't make me special. It made me a hypocrite. Asterisk. The words on the page blurred slightly. Asterisk. You stood there while I laughed at you. You stood there while people pointed cameras at you, while they turned you into a spectacle. And you didn't move. You didn't flinch. Because that's who you are. And I hate that I only learned to respect you after it was too late. Asterisk. James's throat felt tight. Asterisk. but that's the thing about regret. It doesn't let you go. It doesn't let you pretend you didn't see the damage. It follows you, sits on your chest at night, whispers in your ear when you're alone. And I don't want to be the man who shrugs it off. Not anymore. Asterisk. There's a slight indentation in the page here, the pressure of the pen heavier in places, as if Lennox's hand had trembled. Asterisk. My father won't speak to me. My mother barely can. The shop is closed. I lost my job. And I know, God, I know, I brought all of this on myself. I'm not writing this for pity. I'm writing this because the one thing I haven't lost yet is the chance to do something right. Asterisk. James felt his pulse hammering now, a strange tension coiling in his gut. Asterisk. I want to learn. I want to understand what it takes to stand where you stand. I want to know what it feels like to hold my head up when the world is watching and say, this matters. Because I know, I have never truly stood for anything in my life. And if I don't change that now, then I never will. Asterisk. A deep exhale left James's chest. Asterisk. If you let me, I want to meet you. Not as the idiot in the video. Not as the guy who humiliated himself in front of millions. Just as a man who wants to do better. Asterisk. Asterisk. If you don't want that, I understand. But either way, I'm not running from this anymore. Asterisk. Asterisk Lennox. Asterisk. James lowered the letter, his hands resting on the edges of the paper as he stared at the words, letting them settle in his mind. The world had a way of sorting people into categories, those who took responsibility and those who didn't. For days, James had assumed he knew exactly which one Lennox belonged to. But now, holding the weight of his words in his hands, he found himself questioning that certainty. He thought of all the men who had stood where he stood now. The ones who had endured worse, who had suffered more, and still chose duty over resentment. Wasn't that the point? To be more than the moment. To rise above, even when the world gave you every reason to look down. James exhaled, folding the letter carefully, methodically, as if it were something fragile. Then, without another moment of hesitation, he tucked it into his pocket. And he made his decision. The cafe was small, tucked away in a quieter part of London, far from the relentless crowds of tourists that flooded Whitehall. A place where conversations weren't drowned out by the ceaseless hum of the city, where the scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, warm and grounding. Lennox Ward sat at a corner table, his fingers wrapped around a cup that had long since gone cold. He hadn't taken a sip. His leg bounced beneath the table, the only sign of the nervous energy coiled tightly in his chest. He had arrived early, too early. He had spent the last 20 minutes checking the door every time it swung open, half expecting James Holloway to never show. And honestly, Lennox wouldn't blame him if he didn't. The letter had been a desperate attempt. He hadn't even expected a response, much less an agreement to meet. Yet, here he was, waiting, hoping for something he couldn't quite name. The door chimed. Lennox looked up, and there he was. James Holloway stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding in a way that had nothing to do with his uniform. He wasn't wearing it now, but somehow he still carried the same air of discipline, of quiet authority. His posture was straight, his movements deliberate as he scanned the cafe, eyes landing on Lennox with an unreadable expression. Lennox's breath hitched. He stood awkwardly, unsure of the etiquette in a situation like this. Did he shake his hand? Offer some rehearsed apology? He settled for a stiff nod. James approached the table, his expression unreadable, as he pulled out the chair across from him and sat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with everything unsaid, with the weight of their shared history, one that had started in mockery and unraveled into something far more complicated. James exhaled through his nose, eyes steady. You wrote a letter. Lennox nodded, swallowing hard. Yeah. James studied him, gaze sharp but not unkind. And you meant it. There was no accusation in his voice, no anger. Just a quiet insistence that Lennox be honest. Lennox's throat felt tight. He had spent so much of his life dodging responsibility, talking his way out of things, twisting the narrative in his favor. But there was no twisting this, no avoiding it. I did, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. James nodded once, as if that answer was enough for now. He leaned back slightly, arms resting on the table, his fingers interlaced. You said you wanted to understand. What exactly do you think that means? Lennox hesitated. He had asked himself that same question 100 times since writing the letter. It was easy to say he wanted to change, that he wanted to learn, but what did that actually mean? I think, he exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I think I've spent my whole life looking at things the wrong way, seeing people as background characters in my own story. I never stopped to think about what it meant to be on the other side of it. And now that I'm on the other side, now that I know what it feels like, his voice trailed off. He shook his head. I don't want to be that person anymore. James watched him carefully. You do realize that real change isn't about regret. Lennox met his gaze, confused. What do you mean? James's expression remained calm, but there was an intensity behind his words. Regret is easy. You regret what happened because you lost things, your job, your reputation, your father's business. Regret is about wishing things had gone differently for you. He leaned forward slightly, but understanding. That's about realizing that the damage was never just yours to bear. The words settled like stones in Lennox's stomach. James didn't say it cruelly. He wasn't trying to punish him. But the truth of it was undeniable. Lennox had spent weeks drowning in his own misery, in the collapse of his own world. But James had endured humiliation not just in that moment, but in the days that followed, in the countless conversations about his worth, about his discipline, about whether or not he had failed simply by standing there and allowing himself to be mocked. And he had never had the luxury of self-pity. Lennox's hands tightened around his cup. I know, he admitted quietly. I know I can't change what I did. And I know saying sorry doesn't mean anything if I don't do something to make it right. James tilted his head slightly, considering him. So what are you going to do? That was the real question, wasn't it? Lennox had spent years coasting through life, taking nothing seriously, always assuming he could joke his way out of things. But there was no punchline here, no easy escape. He looked James in the eye, and for the first time, he spoke without hesitation. I want to learn what it takes, he said, to stand like you stood that day, to understand what it means to represent something bigger than myself. James raised a brow. You want to be a soldier? Lennox shook his head. No, I'm not looking for some grand redemption arc. He exhaled. I want to earn the right to say I understand, even if it takes years. A long silence stretched between them, and then something shifted. James's expression didn't soften, not exactly, but there was something new there. A flicker of consideration. Lennox wasn't sure if that meant anything, if James believed him, if he even should believe him. But when James finally spoke, there was no dismissal. No final judgment. All right, he said simply. And just like that, the door wasn't closed. Not yet. The morning was colder than usual, the kind of damp chill that seeped into the bones and made itself at home. The sky over London was a dull gray, the clouds thick and unmoving, pressing down on the city like a weight that refused to lift. The air smelled of wet stone and autumn, the streets still slick from the night's rain. People moved briskly through the avenues, bundled in coats and scarves, the steady rhythm of their lives uninterrupted by the events that had turned Lennox Ward's world inside out. He stood outside the barracks, his breath visible in the cold air, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. The uniformed soldiers moved with precision, their steps measured, their posture straight, their presence a stark contrast to his own restless energy. He didn't belong here. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But he was here. That had to mean something. James Holloway had told him to meet him at 6 a.m. sharp. No instructions beyond that. No explanations. Just a time and a place. Lennox had arrived at 5:45, nerves coiling in his stomach, his mind running through every possible outcome. Would James change his mind? Would he take one look at him standing there, an outsider desperate to prove something, and decide it wasn't worth the trouble? Lennox wouldn't blame him if he did. A door opened and James stepped out, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak at first, just glanced at Lennox, taking in the sight of him standing there, the way his shoulders were slightly hunched, his weight shifting from foot to foot. Then finally, "You're on time." Lennox let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Yeah." James studied him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and started walking. Lennox hesitated only a second before following. The streets were quieter in this part of the city, the usual bustle muted in the early morning light. James walked with purpose, his pace steady, his gaze fixed ahead. Lennox had to lengthen his stride to keep up. For a while, neither of them spoke. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but it wasn't easy either. There was something deliberate about it, as if James was waiting to see whether Lennox would break it first. He didn't. They walked past Westminster, the grand buildings standing as they always had, indifferent to the fleeting struggles of the people who moved beneath them. They crossed a quiet bridge, the Thames dark and restless below, the water carrying secrets that had long since been swallowed by time. And then finally James spoke. "You want to understand." It wasn't a question. Lennox nodded. "Yeah." James glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "Then you're going to work." Lennox frowned slightly. "Work." James stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "You think understanding is just about listening? Just about reading a few history books and saying the right things?" His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it, an edge sharpened by experience. Understanding comes from doing, from living it. Lennox felt his pulse quicken. "So what do I do?" James looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding just how much he was willing to give. Then finally, "You're going to train." Lennox blinked. "Train?" James started walking again. Lennox hurried to keep up. "You mocked something you didn't understand," James said, his tone even but firm. "You disrespected the discipline it takes to stand in that uniform, to hold yourself still while people do exactly what you did. And now you want to fix it." He glanced at Lennox. "So you're going to feel it for yourself." Lennox swallowed. "Like military training?" James smirked slightly, but there was no amusement in it. "Not quite, but close enough." They turned a corner, and suddenly the barracks loomed in front of them again. The training grounds stretched beyond, vast and intimidating in the early morning light. James gestured toward them. "You want to learn?" His gaze locked onto Lennox's. "Then start here." Lennox stared at the grounds, at the soldiers already running drills, their breath rising in the cold air, their bodies moving in perfect unison. He felt a flicker of doubt, the familiar urge to run, to find an easier way. But he knew there wasn't one. James was watching him, waiting. Lennox inhaled deeply, and then he stepped forward. The cold gnawed at Lennox Ward's bones, sinking into every inch of exposed skin, wrapping around his muscles like invisible shackles. He had never felt anything like it before, not this kind of relentless, biting chill that didn't just make him uncomfortable, but made him feel small. The sky overhead was a dull, heavy gray, thick with the promise of rain, the kind that soaked through clothes and settled into the marrow of a man's body. He stood still. He had been standing still for hours. His legs ached, his spine burned, his shoulders screamed under the tension of keeping them squared, his head held high, his gaze locked forward at nothing and everything all at once. His breaths were shallow, controlled, each one measured in an attempt to quiet the internal battle raging inside him. James had given no further instructions after that first day. No grand speeches, no reassurances, just a simple command, *stand star. And so Lennox had. He wasn't wearing the full uniform of the Royal Guard, of course. That honor was earned, not given. But he had been made to stand there, hour after hour, in a posture so rigid it felt unnatural, so controlled it felt impossible. He had watched the others, the real guards, standing with effortless discipline, their expressions unreadable, their bodies perfectly still. And next to them, Lennox felt like an imposter, a fraud masquerading in a world he had never belonged to. His body rebelled against him. His muscles twitched, his feet throbbed inside the heavy boots James had forced him to wear. His face ached from the effort of keeping his expression neutral, of fighting every impulse to blink too often, to shift his weight, to move. And the people, God, the people. They walked past him as if he were a statue. They stared. They whispered. Some pointed their cameras, some leaned in close, testing the boundaries, waiting for him to fail. And Lennox felt it, felt the heat of their scrutiny pressing into him. This was what James had endured every day. And Lennox, who had once laughed at that kind of discipline, now stood here, locked inside a war with his own body, fighting against the overwhelming need to break formation, to move. His breath trembled in his throat. He closed his eyes, only for a second, just a second, and then a voice. "Ah, look at this one." Lennox felt his jaw tighten. He knew that voice, that tone, the same kind of voice he had used weeks ago outside Whitehall. He kept his gaze fixed forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. A man, a tourist, American by the sound of him, stepped closer, his laughter thick with amusement, his friends snickering beside him. "This one's trying real hard," the man continued, his voice edging closer, circling Lennox like a predator testing its prey. "Bet we can make him crack." Lennox's hands clenched into fists at his sides. A camera clicked. The man's friends muttered something under their breath, laughing between themselves. Lennox felt his pulse pound in his ears, a deafening drumbeat that drowned out everything else. This was it. This was what James had felt. All those weeks ago, when Lennox had been the one grinning, the one taunting, the one who had assumed this was all just a joke, this had been his cruelty, his thoughtless mockery, the weight of his own ignorance thrown back at him. His breath came sharper now, but he didn't move. He wouldn't give them what they wanted. The man stepped closer, his voice low. "Come on, mate. What happens if I do this?" Lennox felt it, a slight movement in his peripheral vision, a sudden lurch toward him. The man feigned a quick jab at his face, testing for a reaction. Lennox didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't move, and suddenly the laughter faltered. The amusement in the air thinned, like a candle's flame flickering in the wind. Because he didn't react, because he wasn't playing along. And for the first time, Lennox understood the quiet power of stillness. It wasn't about ignoring them. It wasn't about being indifferent. It was about control, about refusing to let them dictate the moment, about standing firm in the face of ridicule, not because it was easy, but because it meant something. The man took a step back, suddenly uncertain. His laughter had lost its edge, his bravado hollow now that he wasn't getting the reaction he wanted. His friends muttered something, shifting awkwardly, and then, just like that, they lost interest. They walked away, and Lennox was still standing. The silence settled around him once more, thick and weighted. His body screamed, his lungs burned, his muscles ached, but he was still standing. James had been watching from a distance. Lennox didn't know how long he had been there, but now, as the last of the tourists moved on, James stepped forward, his expression unreadable. They stood there, facing each other, the space between them heavy with something that hadn't existed before. James tilted his head slightly. "So," he said, voice low even, "what did you learn?" Lennox swallowed. His throat was dry, his lips chapped from the cold. His body begged for release, for movement, for anything other than this rigid posture. But he didn't move. Not yet. He met James's gaze, and he understood. Karma had its way of balancing the scales. And today, Lennox Ward had finally felt the weight of what he had once dismissed. His voice was hoarse when he spoke. "I get it now." James studied him for a long moment. Then finally he nodded. And for the first time, something almost like respect flickered in his eyes. The air inside the grand hall was thick with anticipation. A quiet hum of murmured voices filled the space, bouncing softly off the high ceilings where chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the polished wooden floors. The audience was gathering, some shifting in their seats, others exchanging hushed words, the anticipation threading through them like a silent current. Lennox Ward stood behind the heavy velvet curtain, his pulse pounding in his throat. His hands, slightly clammy, gripped the edges of the wooden podium that had been set up for him. Beyond the curtain, rows of people filled the seats, journalists, military officials, civilians, even a few of the very same tourists who had once laughed alongside him. They were all here for the same reason, to witness whatever was about to happen next. His heart clenched. How had it come to this? Just weeks ago, he had been untouchable, carefree, arrogant, moving through life with the kind of reckless abandon that only someone who had never truly been humbled could afford. And now he was about to stand before an audience who had already judged him, who had already decided what kind of man he was. His name had become a headline, a joke, a cautionary tale whispered across dinner tables. And now he was about to do something he had spent his whole life avoiding. He was about to take responsibility. The thought sent a wave of nausea rolling through him. James Holloway stood beside him, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He hadn't said much since they'd arrived. He didn't need to. His presence alone was grounding, a silent reminder of why Lennox was here in the first place. Lennox inhaled deeply, forcing air into his lungs. "You sure about this?" he muttered, voice low. James didn't look at him, his eyes fixed ahead. "Are you?" The question hit harder than it should have, because the truth was Lennox wasn't sure. He had spent so long thinking about what this moment would feel like, whether he'd stumble over his words, whether the audience would tear him apart, whether this was even worth it. But now, standing here, the weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him in a way he hadn't expected. James finally turned to face him, his gaze steady. "This isn't about proving anything to them." He gestured toward the crowd beyond the curtain. "This is about proving something to yourself." Lennox swallowed hard. The thought terrified him. Because if he failed here, if he stood in front of these people, and his words rang hollow, then what was left? Was redemption even possible? A deep voice boomed from the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Lennox Ward." A hush fell over the crowd. Lennox felt his stomach twist into knots. This was it. James gave him a single nod, barely perceptible, but it was enough. Lennox stepped forward. As he emerged onto the stage, the sheer magnitude of the moment hit him all at once. The room was larger than it had seemed from behind the curtain, the rows of people stretching farther than he had anticipated. Camera flashes flickered, the dull glow of recording devices blinking in the audience. The weight of 100 eyes fell on him, waiting, judging. He gripped the podium tightly, his knuckles turning white. For a moment, he thought he might crack under the pressure. That his mind would go blank, that his voice would falter, that this entire thing would collapse before it even started. But then, from the corner of his vision, he saw James. Standing near the edge of the stage, arms still crossed, watching. Silent, steady. Lennox took a slow, measured breath. And then he began. "I never thought I'd be standing here," he said, his voice carrying through the hall, strong but edged with something raw. "I never thought I'd be this person, the guy who became the story, the example of what not to do. But here I am." A murmur rippled through the audience. He clenched his hands, then loosened them. "I spent my whole life believing that the world owed me something, that I could move through it however I wanted, say whatever I wanted, do whatever I wanted, because consequences were for other people. Not me." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I was wrong." The admission felt heavier than he expected. "I disrespected something I didn't understand," he continued, forcing himself to meet the eyes of the audience, to own it. "I mocked a tradition, a discipline, a man who had spent years dedicating himself to something greater than himself. And I did it because I thought it was funny." His throat tightened. But it wasn't. Silence. "I didn't think about the history behind it. I didn't think about the sacrifices it took. I didn't think about him." He nodded toward James, who remained still, unreadable. "I only thought about myself." The weight of his own words pressed into him. "And when it all came crashing down, when people started calling me out, when my life started unraveling, I did what I always did." He let out a humorless chuckle. "I blamed everyone but myself." A shift in the audience. Some nods. Some still wary. Lennox took another breath. He had to push forward. "But something changed," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Because for the first time in my life, I listened. I learned. And I realized that this isn't about one mistake. This is about the kind of person I want to be moving forward." His fingers curled against the wood of the podium. "This isn't a plea for forgiveness. It's not some PR stunt." He let his gaze sweep over the audience. "I don't expect people to change their minds about me overnight. Hell, maybe some of you never will. And that's fair. I earned that." A long silence. "But I also know this. I could be better than the person I was that day. And I will be." The room was utterly still. For the first time, Lennox didn't fear the silence. He embraced it. He had spoken his truth. And whatever came next, he was ready for it. The applause had faded, leaving behind only the distant murmur of conversation and the lingering weight of the moment that had just unfolded. The grand hall had begun to empty, people filtering out in quiet clusters, their voices hushed with the aftertaste of something significant. Some left with their opinions unchanged, some with a newfound respect, and others with expressions that hovered somewhere between curiosity and skepticism. But the world outside kept turning, as it always did. Lennox Ward remained standing on the stage, his hands still gripping the edges of the wooden podium, though now there was no one left to hear him speak. The adrenaline that had carried him through the speech had begun to wane, leaving exhaustion in its place. His heartbeat, which had once been a frantic drum against his ribs, had settled into something slower, heavier, like the quiet hum of an engine finally winding down. He had done it. He had stood before the world, not to excuse himself, not to plead for sympathy, but to own every inch of his failure, to let it sit in the open air and be examined by those who had every right to judge him. He had prepared himself for rejection, for mockery, for a cold silence that would confirm that he had lost the public forever. But instead, he had been met with something else. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something close. A pause. A consideration. A moment where people were willing to listen. And perhaps that was the first step. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing ever so slightly. For the first time in weeks, the weight pressing down on him felt different, not gone but bearable. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. James Holloway stood at the bottom of the stage, watching him with the same unreadable expression he had worn since the beginning of this journey. He was still in uniform, his posture effortless in its discipline, his hands clasped behind his back. Even now, with the room emptying around them, he held himself like a man who knew exactly who he was. Lennox envied that. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then James tilted his head slightly. "You didn't embarrass yourself." It wasn't a compliment. Not exactly. But coming from him, it was something. Lennox let out a breath of dry amusement, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, that's progress, I guess." James stepped forward, his footsteps measured, deliberate. "You said the right words." He studied Lennox with the sharp eyes of someone who had spent years reading people, dissecting the spaces between what they said and what they actually meant. But saying something and meaning it are two different things. Lennox's jaw tightened. He met James's gaze head-on. "I meant every word." James didn't look away, as if searching for any hesitation, any fracture of insincerity. He found none. A beat passed. Then James gave a slow, approving nod. "Then prove it." Lennox frowned slightly. "I just did." No, James's tone was even unwavering. "You spoke it. Now you have to live it." The words settled between them, heavier than the silence that followed. Lennox knew what he meant. He had spent weeks trying to undo the damage of a single reckless moment, trying to make amends in ways that were visible, measurable. But James wasn't interested in public displays. He wasn't interested in apologies wrapped in grand gestures. He was interested in consistency, in who Lennox would be when the cameras were off, when no one was watching. And that, Lennox realized, was the real test. He nodded, his throat tight. "I will." James studied him for another long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the thinning crowd. Lennox remained there, alone on the stage, the echoes of his own voice still lingering in his mind. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. And for the first time in his life, he was ready for what came next. The crisp London air wrapped around Lennox ward like an old memory, familiar and weighted with the past. The city had not changed, not in any way that mattered. The same streets, the same buildings standing firm against time, the same distant murmur of voices weaving through the cold wind. But Lennox had changed. And now, for the first time, he had returned, not as a tourist, not as a spectacle, but as a man seeking the last piece of something he couldn't quite name. The streets of Whitehall stretched before him, bustling as they always had, filled with visitors and locals alike. Camera flashes illuminated the edges of his vision, voices layered on top of each other in various languages, blending into an indistinct hum. But he wasn't paying attention to any of it. His focus was locked on the figure standing just ahead, unmoving, unwavering. James Holloway, the man he had once mocked, the man who had become the symbol of everything he had misunderstood. He stood at his post in full uniform, the crisp red tunic unwrinkled, the tall bearskin hat shadowing his face, but Lennox didn't need to see his expression to know that James was aware of him. He always was. It was part of the job. But James did not move. Not when Lennox stopped a few feet away. Not when he exhaled, the cold air leaving his lips in a slow, visible breath. Not when the weight of the moment settled thick between them. And that was the point, wasn't it? Lennox didn't need James to acknowledge him. That wasn't why he was here. He wasn't seeking validation or approval or even forgiveness. He was here because he needed to be. Because there were lessons in life that could only be learned through experience, through pain, through loss. And because karma, when it finally came for him, had not been swift or merciful. It had been slow, grinding, deliberate. It had stripped him down, forced him to look at himself in the mirror, forced him to reckon with the consequences of his own arrogance. Lennox stood still. He had spent the past weeks learning discipline, restraint, the power of silence. And now he used it. His feet remained planted, his spine straight, his hands resting at his sides, resisting the urge to shove them into his pockets. It was a small thing, insignificant to anyone watching, but to him it mattered. Because this was not the Lennox Ward who had first stood here weeks ago, sneering, laughing, treating another man's dignity as a joke. That Lennox Ward was gone, and in his place was someone new. The minutes stretched. A tourist brushed past him, pausing just beside James. A young man, eager, grinning, full of the same kind of carelessness that Lennox had once worn so easily. He raised a phone, adjusting the angle of the shot, leaning in closer than he should have. Lennox tensed. The tourist smirked, whispering something to his companion, his body shifting forward, testing the space between himself and James. It was all so familiar, too familiar, and in that moment, something inside Lennox snapped. He stepped forward, not aggressively, not in anger, but with purpose. The tourist barely had time to register the movement before Lennox's voice cut through the space between them, firm, unyielding. "Don't." The young man froze, his fingers hovering over his phone screen. He turned, startled, eyes flickering between Lennox and James as if trying to gauge what was happening. Lennox's expression remained steady. "Just don't," he repeated, his voice quieter now, but no less commanding. The tourist hesitated, glancing at James, who still had not moved, who would never move, not unless duty demanded it. And then, perhaps sensing the shift in the moment, the tourist exhaled sharply, rolling his eyes as he muttered, "Whatever, man." And he walked away. Lennox let out a slow breath, his heart still hammering against his ribs. He hadn't done it to be a hero. He hadn't done it to prove anything to James. He had done it because he finally understood. He turned back to face the guard, the silence between them stretching, shifting, changing into something different. And then, so subtly that no one else would have noticed, James moved. It was not much, just a slight shift in his stance, a barely perceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement. Lennox felt something in his chest tighten. And then, with one final glance, he turned and walked away. Not because he was running, not because he was ashamed, but because for the first time in his life, he didn't need to be seen to know his own worth. And that was enough.